Welcome to episode 203 of the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome's series of weekly webinars. Today we have a very special guest who will talk primarily about hydrogen's role in a green economy. You've heard me talk about hydrogen before. I've started a journey many years ago researching hydrogen because I figured that if so many people, so many smart people were saying that the future is a hydrogen economy, then there must be some facts to support it. But I came to the same conclusions that Paul will outline in his presentation. There are many competing technologies that are being proposed to decarbonize a variety of processes. Entrenched incumbents are proposing solutions that are in their own self-interest, but we have to ask as to whether they are good uses of the scarce resources we have. It's not usually a question of whether those technologies work, but rather a question of whether we have better and more viable alternatives. So Paul Martin is a Toronto-based chemical engineer. I'll let him introduce himself in more detail. Paul is a co-founder of the Hydrogen Science Coalition. It's a nonprofit group of academics and retired engineers and scientists who, from a position of free financial interest, so that's really important, a position of free financial interest, offer a science-based and fact-based perspective about the role of hydrogen in the energy transition. Paul, I ran into Paul several times over the years, and Michael Liebrich, who is the founder of New Energy Finance, which became Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and who is one of the leading voices working to understand which green solutions make sense. Michael gives Paul credit for the concept that hydrogen is like a Swiss Army knife. It could be used for many purposes, but it's not particularly good at any of them. So Paul has a series of essays on LinkedIn that explain in detail and with actual numbers many of the topics related to the energy transition beyond just hydrogen. You'll see links at the end of the presentation for that. So welcome, Paul, and over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and welcome everyone. Thank you for your attention. So the topic of the talk today, as mentioned, is two things, though. Hydrogen, separating the inappropriate hyperbole-based hopium from reality, and also a little bit of a talk about strategies for decarbonization that will work. So first of all, who is this guy that's talking to you? Why should you listen to what he has to say? I am an experienced chemical engineer. I've been around for a long time. And my specialty is in helping people develop new chemical process technology. I've been doing that for basically the entirety of my career. As part of that work, I've done innumerable projects related to making hydrogen and synthesis gas mixtures and using hydrogen and trying to suppress its formation and reactions. And basically, I've had a lot to do with hydrogen. Hydrogen is a very important chemical. I'm listed as co-inventor on a number of hydrogen-related patents. I now operate as an independent consultant. I am my own boss. I have clients. I don't have bosses anymore. And I don't have any money riding on this stuff either way. So my opinion on these matters is free of financial interest one way or another. I'm not invested heavily in batteries. I'm not invested heavily in hydrogen or in hydrogen's alternatives. And that qualifies me to be one of the co-founders of the Hydrogen Science Coalition. All of our members are in that fortunate position. We derive our incomes from things other than either hydrogen or its alternatives. And so we can tell the truth as we see it from the basis of science and with the interest of decarbonization. And just as a curiosity, you'll see the hood of a car hanging from the ceiling behind me. That's the hood of my 1975 Triumph Spitfire that my son and I converted to an electric car in 2014. And then unfortunately in 2018, somebody hit me with a big pickup truck in that car. And I had to do it again. And this is what the new one looks like. This is a 1973 Triumph TR6. So similar, but slightly better car than the Spitfire was. And it's electric drivetrain under the hood. And I did that as a learning experience and to help train my son, learn a few things in the process for both of us, and also to be able to make good measurements in relation to electric vehicles to confirm the claims that were being made. And I drove that Spitfire back and forth to work for quite a few years before I got hit. And this car I keep off the highway because I really don't want to go through that experience again. So let's talk about hydrogen. What do we hear about hydrogen in the media? We hear lots about hydrogen in the media. There are lots and lots of people talking about it, many of whom are talking about it from a position of either direct conflict of interest, meaning they have money riding on it, or from a position of moral hazard, which means that they benefit from the attempt to do something with hydrogen, whether it succeeds or fails. And they don't benefit from if we don't bother with hydrogen. So unfortunately, the landscape of ideas in relation to hydrogen is very polluted with interest, and that makes it very difficult to make sense of one way or another. So I'm going to try my best to help here. What we hear in the media is that it's the most abundant element in the universe, which is true and irrelevant because on Earth it's almost never found uncombined. So that there's lots of hydrogen in water in the oceans really is neither here nor there. That makes no difference. You hear that you can burn it in a fuel cell. Now that means burn it in a fuel cell, because if you burn it in air, you get a lot more than just water. You get nitrous oxide or nitrogen oxides, for instance, when you burn anything in air, including hydrogen. You hear that green hydrogen, which is hydrogen made by electrolysis of water using nice clean electricity, will be super cheap in the future. We hear that we could use electricity that would otherwise go to waste. And again, we hear that it's really versatile, that it's the Swiss Army knife of energy because it has so many potential uses. And as mentioned, I posted a picture of this particular Swiss Army knife here. This is the Wenger Giant. And you can imagine it weighs several pounds, and it's very awkward, not particularly good at any particular purpose. It's not a very good knife. It's a terrible corkscrew, etc. And that's very much like hydrogen when you use it for anything other than as a chemical where its specific properties are required. It's possible to use it for all sorts of things. Doesn't mean that it's a good choice. We hear that it's necessary and ideal for the hard to decarbonize sectors, and we're going to talk about heating and transport in particular and see if it makes sense there. Where people talk about hard to decarbonize, they largely mean things that are difficult to do directly with electricity. We also hear that it's the only feasible way to do seasonal storage. And most of these are wishful thinking statements or statements of hope, and there's nothing wrong with hope. Hope's wonderful, but it has to be, you have to hold your hope within the limits of thermodynamics, because otherwise the universe will disagree with you, and that's pretty uncomfortable. So what's hydrogen? Hydrogen is actually a massive decarbonization problem. It's not much of a decarbonization solution to anything. And the reason for that is that we make an awful lot of it. We make 120 million tons of it a year, round numbers, as pure hydrogen and in mixtures with other gases. And we make almost all of it, about 99% of it, from fossils without carbon capture. That hydrogen production has greater GHG emissions than the entire aviation industry. In fact, its emissions are almost as great as aviation and shipping combined. We make almost none of it by electrolysis of water using clean electricity. And another little thing that's important is to know is that almost all of it is made exactly where it's used. It doesn't move any distance at all because it's big and bulky. The biggest uses of hydrogen by far are in petroleum refining and ammonia production. Ammonia is extremely important. It's feeding about half the humans and their food animals on Earth as a nitrogen fertilizer. So we'll need that in a decarbonized future. Desulfurizing petroleum before we burn it, well, we won't be doing quite so much of that in the decarbonized future, although we'll still be making chemicals and materials from petroleum, and we'll need to desulfurize that. So that bar, which here is the dark blue colored one, it's shrinking to about a quarter to a fifth of what it is today in the decarbonized future. But the others are going to remain more or less. And the others are things like methanol production, direct iron reduction, and various other chemicals uses. So in a decarbonized future, for sure, we're going to need at least 90 million tons a year. And we have to replace basically all of it that we make today. What does that look like? Well, we'll look at it in a little bit more detail. First of all, we have to look at how do we make hydrogen? Well, we know why we make it. We make it because it's a useful molecule. But how do we make it? We start with an energy source That's either methane in the form of natural gas or electricity, although we can also use coal and petroleum and other things. So the first conclusion we can draw immediately is that hydrogen is a fuel made from another fuel or another energy source. So it's a derived material. Then we feed that energy to a device, a machine that we have to pay money for, which is a steam methane reformer or an electrolyzer. And we can, unfortunately, draw another conclusion right away. In that process of making hydrogen out of that starting energy, we throw away about 30% of the energy. And that's more or less an intrinsic thing. It's very difficult to improve on that much. We also spend money, and if we're starting with natural gas, we end up with greenhouse gas emissions in the form of both methane and CO2. So the second conclusion we can draw is that hydrogen can never be cheaper than the things it's made from. It can't be cheaper than methane, and it can't be cheaper than the electricity that you're making it from, because we have to spend money and we lose some of the energy in the process of making it. So now we've got 70% of our original energy in the form of lower heating value of hydrogen. What can we do with that? Well, one pathway of use is to compress it or liquefy it or make it into something else. And in those processes, we can lose between 10% and 90% of the remaining energy. And then we can feed it to a fuel cell or a turbine and lose another 40 to 50%. And then we'll end up with electricity or mechanical energy to move a vehicle, for instance. Well, when you multiply those efficiencies, in the very, very best case, using the best case of every one of these, we end up with about a third of the energy we started with. So buy 3 kilowatt hours, get 1 back. Doesn't sound like a very good deal unless you're selling electricity. Terrible deal if you're buying it. So conclusion number 3 is hydrogen is a really terrible battery. And that's intrinsically true, and it's true for reasons that are fundamental. You're not going to fix that. You're not going to improve that from 37% energy recovery to 60% energy recovery ever. Like ever, with any innovation. The other use pathway is to take the hydrogen, just burn it, and if you burn it in air, you get NOx, which is toxic and it shortens people's lives. So you can mitigate that with catalysts and so on, but still, it's like burning anything. And you lose a bunch more energy in that process of making heat, especially if it's high temperature. So the best case there looks a little better. We lose about a third rather than 2/3 of the energy in that process. But it's still not a particularly good way to make heat. Now let's look at what it would take to just replace the 90 million tons of hydrogen that we will for sure need in a decarbonized future with hydrogen that's made by electrolysis of water. Round numbers, it takes about 50 kilowatt hours per kilogram of hydrogen that we make to make it from water using electricity. And that's actually a really optimistic figure. Like I've never seen an electrolyzer quote from a manufacturer that will give that as a guaranteed figure at full output. But it's a nice round number. And if we multiply it out, we need 4,500 terawatt hours of electricity to make 90 million tons a year of hydrogen. And world wind and solar production in 2019 was only 2,100 terawatt hours. So we would need more than twice as much as all the wind and solar that was on Earth in 2019 to make that much hydrogen. Now, in 2024, there's a lot more wind and solar, and we might actually break even by this point. Who knows? We might be able to deploy all of the wind and solar on Earth just to replace black hydrogen with green hydrogen. But does that sound realistic to you? It doesn't sound realistic to me at all. It's a very important problem and one we have to solve in a decarbonized future, and yet we're making no progress on it at all. There's basically no meaningful amount of green hydrogen being made in the world at all right now. And the other conclusion we can draw is that the notion that we'll have an excess of green hydrogen to use in inefficient use cases is premature by decades. It's important to talk about money for a moment, and I don't want to bore you, but black hydrogen, hydrogen made from natural gas without carbon capture, that some people call gray, but black is more accurate. It costs about $1.50 per kilogram wholesale if you make it from natural gas in a place where natural gas is fairly inexpensive, like in the southern states. And just to if you take 3 cents a kilowatt hour and you multiply that by 50 kilowatt hours per kilogram, that's $1.50 just for the electricity, and you're already at the price of what the black product costs. So on a wholesale basis, that doesn't leave any money to pay anything for equipment like an electrolyzer or anything else. And the problem is that electrolyzers are not just not free, they're expensive. They're actually quite expensive, and they'll get cheaper in the future, but part of the process is the electrolyzer, and the other part is what's called the balance of plant. And it's ordinary stuff like tanks and pumps and buildings and driveways and concrete foundations and stuff like that. And that stuff's not going to get cheaper just because we make more of them. So hydrogen fundamentally is structurally expensive, especially when we waste it as a fuel. Well, when we look at the economics, we can draw a few conclusions, and that is that if electrolyzers are expensive, then we can't run them part-time. So this notion that you're just going to run them every once in a while when wind or solar are in excess is just a myth. It does not make economic sense. If you want to make green hydrogen cheaply, and we really will need to make lots of it, as mentioned, to replace the black stuff, we need giant scale, which means we need wind and solar in combination that are not correlated with one another in respect to time. And we need to produce it at giant scale, meaning gigawatt scale type projects, in order to make it reasonably economical. The places that have that high capacity factor, wind and solar, that are anti-correlated in time, they tend to be remote, meaning far away from people that need electricity, which is really important. But that also means that they're far away from anybody that needs hydrogen, which leaves the problem of moving hydrogen, which is actually not a trivial problem when you're talking about moving it across oceans. And the other problem is, who's paying for all the expensive hydrogen that you have to pay for in order to get electrolyzers cheap enough to make cheap hydrogen? And the answer to that is always we, individuals and businesses as taxpayers. So blue hydrogen to the rescue. And I really apologize for these colors, but the industry has used these colors as a meme and kind of as a bit of disinformation. These colors are all a euphemism, and unfortunately, they are the parlance that people use. So we have to use them. We're kind of stuck using them. But when people talk about blue hydrogen, what they're talking about is making hydrogen the good old-fashioned way from fossils, but capturing the CO2 in the process and shoving it in the ground and hoping it doesn't come back. And you can do that. I mean, we are doing that at scale in Canada at a project in Alberta called Shell Quest. We know what it costs, and we know how to do it. We know how to do it partially, which is all Shell Quest does. But basically, if you look at a model of making hydrogen, you take natural gas and you take about a third of it and you put it into a burner and you burn it. And that's why a third of it ends up being lost. And a bunch of emissions occur from that combustion. And those CO2 emissions are hard to capture because they're at low concentration. And then the remaining CO2 that comes out of these reactors and gas purification system, that stuff's possible to capture, but that's only about half of the CO2, unfortunately, because some of the gas purification mixture goes back into the burner by this path. And its CO2 comes out here where it's hard to capture. So unfortunately, blue hydrogen, in the end, it results in a minor CO2 equivalent mitigation in return for a major cost. And more accurately, it should be called bruise-colored hydrogen because it's kind of black and blue rather than blue. The other conclusion that you can draw is that if you want to fix hydrogen production and capture more of the CO2, you've got to get rid of this burning stuff that's going on here, and you use a piece of equipment that's called an autothermal reformer. Those are possible, and they're well developed. They exist. They've existed since the 1980s, but they're not as efficient as steam reformers, and they also don't allow the capture of all of the CO2. So unfortunately, you do still end up with a problem making this product, and of course, you end up with the cost of sequestering all of that CO2, which is not trivial. In fact, on Quest, it costs about $165 per ton that it captures, and it doesn't capture very much. It only goes after the easiest stuff. The other conclusion is that you can't really make hydrogen from coal using this method and expect it to be economic. It's just nuts. You would never do it. So now we're going to jump on to talk about hydrogen use cases. And the one that was popular in the 1990s was cars and light trucks, because we were looking at trying to get rid of tailpipe emissions largely. It was more about toxic tailpipe emissions that generate smog than it was about trying to deal with greenhouse gas emissions. And hydrogen was being looked at there as an option. And at the time, it seemed to be pretty much the only option. But in the meantime, we've invented lithium-ion batteries, and we've scaled them to the point where they're inexpensive enough to put in cars and make electric cars practical. And when you look at the Toyota Mirai and the Tesla Model 3 long-range version, which are two cars that you could buy, and you compare them one against the other, and these cars, by the way, they have very similar ranges. One's 312 miles per the EPA test, and the other's 334 miles. When you compare them side by side, the hydrogen car costs more, it weighs more. It's not lighter, it weighs more. It's half as quick to accelerate. But the big thing that kills it is that it uses over 3.2 times as much energy as the battery electric car, and it costs at least 5 times as much per mile driven as a result of wasting all that extra energy. On the plus side, it is faster to refuel than it is to recharge a Model 3. But that's only true if there's a fueling station on your route, and the fueling stations are very expensive. So unfortunately, this is not looking good. And if you look at the sales figures of the Mirai versus electric vehicles, you can find out that the market has decided hydrogen cars and light trucks are a dead end. They're not going to happen. So what about trucks? What's happened is that the people that were really excited about cars realized that hydrogen cars aren't really going to be a thing. So they've retreated to trucks and buses and the like. And they argue that trucks are hard to electrify, but it's a bit of a puzzle as to why. The big argument is, well, batteries are heavy, and that must mean that they're no good for trucks. But when you look at it, you talk, for instance, to the North American Center for Freight Efficiency, you find out that about 75% of freight loads gross out, meaning they're limited by the volume of the truck or the floor area of the trailer, not by the total gross vehicle weight. So if you had to put an extra 2 or 3 tons of batteries on the truck, that wouldn't actually determine whether or not you could ship about 75% of the loads. The 25% that remain are often tankers full of things like gasoline and diesel that hopefully we won't be shipping very much of in the future. So the notion that batteries are heavy, therefore you can't use them, is just not a valid argument against electric trucks. The other argument is that, well, you can't do electric trucks for long distance trucking, like trucking to remote and rural locations, like up ice roads into northern Canada. The problem is you can't do hydrogen for those either, because the fuel logistics don't make sense. Hydrogen distribution and dispensing are both very expensive. They're not as simple as just hooking up a hose, and you'll see that in pictures in a moment. And small-scale hydrogen manufacture, in order to get rid of the distribution of hydrogen to all of these stations, drives up the cost of the hydrogen that's produced as a result of the capital not being used very efficiently. And unfortunately, it also means that you'll be distributing electricity to all of those places, which you could have just used to charge electric vehicles. So it's really kind of, when you look at it, the devil's in the details, and the devil isn't hiding. He's there waving his pitchfork at you. Hydrogen's problem is that it's neither efficient, meaning it wastes a lot of energy. It's not efficient in using energy, nor is it effective, meaning it's not easy to transport and dispense and store. When you use it as a fuel, it's neither efficient nor effective. And, gasoline is the opposite example. Gasoline's not very efficient, but boy, is it effective. It's a liquid. It's very easy to transport. It's got a super high energy density per unit mass and volume. So we are happy to trade loss of efficiency from using an engine that's not very efficient in order to take advantage of those effectiveness benefits of, ease of storage and transport. But hydrogen doesn't offer either of them. It's low efficiency, which comes from something that a thermodynamicist would call exergy destruction, basically wasting the fact that you're starting with electricity, which is nearly pure thermodynamic work, and putting it through too many steps, each of which has losses associated with it. The result of that exergy destruction is structurally high energy cost. It just simply isn't cheap per joule of energy that the hydrogen contains. The fact that there are too many steps means, each of which requires equipment that you have to pay for, means that it has a high attributed capital cost. And the low energy density per unit volume, despite its really excellent energy density per unit mass, means that it has poor effectiveness. And when you run the numbers, you actually find out that the energy density per unit volume of hydrogen stored on board a truck at 350 bar is about the same as a Tesla's battery pack, except it's worse for the hydrogen unit because the tanks have to be cylindrical and they have hemispherical ends, so they don't actually pack together very well. They're not very space efficient. And the way that people tend in the industry to try to contend with the problem of this low effectiveness due to the poor energy density per unit volume is to try to make hydrogen into something else, like a so-called e-fuel. The fundamental problem of e-fuels, though, which you'll see coming along in the talk, is that they're a way to try to increase effectiveness, but they further reduce efficiency and they multiply the cost. So unfortunately, they make one thing worse at the expense of trying to solve the other problem. As I mentioned, hydrogen distribution and dispensing are structurally expensive. And here's an example. This is a DOT certified Class 8 tube trailer full of hydrogen. And that trailer, most of the weight of it is obviously not hydrogen. It's steel tubes that contain the hydrogen at high pressure. And that trailer, that whole trailer load pulled by a tractor, can carry only about 380 kilograms of hydrogen. Now, there are people working on carbon fiber tanks, and they might be able to fit 1 ton or 1,000 kilograms of hydrogen on a tube trailer if they can ever get DOT to approve it, because it's not fire safe because of its construction, unlike this one. But anyway, if you were to compare it against this one, a Class 8 diesel tanker truck carries 11,000 gallons of diesel, which is about the same energy in effectiveness terms once you've converted it back to take into account the efficiency of the engine of the truck versus the efficiency of a fuel cell in a fuel cell truck. It's still about the equivalent of 30 hydrogen trailers. So if we manage to increase that from 380 to 1,000, maybe it'll get down to 10 hydrogen trailers needed to replace every diesel trailer. So you can see right there, that kind of distribution is insanely expensive. The other thing is that just like in The Wizard of Oz, people think that it's nice and simple. We have a dispenser with a hose, and that's all that's going on. And it's that hydrogen is just a replacement for gasoline in that simple-minded way. But just like in The Wizard of Oz, behind the curtain, behind this fence here, is a whole bunch of kit that takes up space, represents a hazard, needs maintenance, costs capital, etc. And to give you an example of what's behind the fence, this picture is a picture of what was used to keep a hydrogen engine vehicle on the road for Toyota for a 24-hour race. That's 2 Class 8 tube trailers full of hydrogen, a trailer full of compressors and chilling equipment, and then the diesel generators that run the whole works. So it's not this simple. There's a lot to it, and it arises from the physical properties of hydrogen, which are not going to change. So, okay, cars are dead. What about trucks? Well, we talked about it. Hydrogen's possible for trucks, but without the scale of cars, the fuel cells are still going to be expensive. EV trucks are coming, and they will offer lower total cost of ownership by virtue of the fact that the energy cost is lower than that of even diesel. Truly long distance transport can't handle hydrogen, so there's no use case for them there. And biofuels can decarbonize those rural and remote trucking applications at lower total cost of ownership than hydrogen can. But it really begs the question, will there be enough? The good news is that this rural and remote stuff is actually such a small fraction of total trucking that it kind of doesn't matter how we solve it. We could probably just keep burning fossils there and be okay. So how about aircraft and ships? Well, both aircraft and ships do need liquid fuels. Okay, that's true, but unfortunately for hydrogen, hydrogen is not a liquid, and when you make a liquid out of it, its energy density is only barely a little bit better. It's only 71 kilograms a cubic meter, even as a liquid, and it liquefies at 20 degrees above absolute zero. So making a liquid out of it is difficult and energy intensive, and then keeping it a liquid is very difficult. Distributing it as a liquid is very lossy because a lot of it boils off. So liquid hydrogen is really not an option. It's not an option for aircraft, and it's not an option for shipping either. Both of those are going to need liquid fuels. And as liquid fuels, biofuels are a much better choice. And we will need some hydrogen production to make those biofuels for aviation and shipping. The rest of transport, all of land transport, nearshore and inshore shipping, short distance aviation, that's all going electric without question. Shipping, my bet for shipping is that both gaseous and liquid hydrogen are impractical, but methanol is probably the best choice, and making it from biomass definitely makes more sense than trying to make it from hydrogen and CO2, which is possible but very expensive. As I mentioned, biomass needs hydrogen to make biofuels out of it. Ultimately, there are ways you can do it without, but they tend to introduce other losses. If you're going to start with cellulose, the average formula for cellulose is roughly this, C6H10O5. And not only are there not enough H's to match up with these C's, all of these oxygens need to come off these molecules as water. So that requires 5 more hydrogen molecules. So we need a hydrogen molecule to make up this deficit, and then we need 5 more to get rid of water, and as a consequence, we need hydrogen. So this is actually going to be a use of hydrogen in the decarbonized future, is helping us to make biofuels from cellulose. The notion of e-fuels, though, where you make make a fuel like ammonia, which honestly, ammonia being a toxic gas, the notion of using it as a fuel absolutely horrifies me as an experienced chemical engineer. It will lead to deaths, and those deaths will be unnecessary relative to using other options. So, but even if we were to look at it dispassionately and forget about the toxic issues as if they were manageable, which I don't think they are, from an energy consumption perspective, it's just so ridiculously lossy. I mean, before for hydrogen, we were talking about 37%. These guys are saying 33 to 42% efficiency for hydrogen as a vehicle fuel. Well, if you start doing power to liquid conversion to make diesel or gasoline type replacements, you're talking about dropping that by another third, to another third. So dropping it from 33% to 10% or thereabouts. And that's just not good enough. Such efficiencies are so poor that the cost will just be astronomical and not worth considering. When you look at it, here's an example. This is called a Sankey diagram, where I've taken the notion of taking a 1 megawatt hour of electricity that's produced in Quebec and feeding it through this company TES plans a project in Shawinigan, where they were going to take electricity, make hydrogen out of it, and then transmit it as hydrogen to a plant that will then react it with CO2 to make methane, and by so doing lose another enormous chunk of energy. And then they want to feed that methane into the natural gas grid where it will be burned to make heat. And you can see, even on a very optimistic level, taking the best case of all of these steps, only about a third of the energy that you fed as electricity ends up as heat in a person's home as a result of this, and the other 2/3 are wasted. And that's not worth paying any public subsidy for, that's for sure. When we talk about hydrogen for heating, the problem is that for 800,000 years, we've been burning stuff to make heat. And so we ask ourselves the wrong question. Instead of asking the right question, we ask the question, well, we can't burn fossils anymore. What else can we burn? The question we should be asking is, we can't burn fossils anymore. How else can we deliver the heat that we need without making greenhouse gas emissions? And the answer to that question is almost never hydrogen. The reality of hydrogen as a natural gas replacement is that, the low pressure pipes that are mostly plastic that distribute natural gas to homes, those would probably be okay to use with hydrogen, although there are still some risks there. The pipe sizes are probably okay, although that it's arguable that we could argue about that. The technical details are a little bit more complex. The medium and the high pressure pipes, unfortunately, the ones that carry natural gas long distances across country, those are made out of the wrong kind of steel, and they will suffer embrittlement, not just at welds, but in the bulk of the material. And that can happen even when you're blending hydrogen into the natural gas lines, and definitely will happen if you switch those natural gas lines to pure hydrogen. The other problem is that blending, if you blend 20% hydrogen, which is kind of the understood limit that you can do without any further modification of a substantial nature, 20% by volume sounds like a lot, but it's only 6% by energy content and about 7% by maximum greenhouse gas emission reduction potential, even if the hydrogen that's being produced is as clean and pure as the driven snow. So whereas you think you're replacing 20% of it, you're only really replacing 7%. When you look at this and you spin it out and you compare using electricity for the UK, for instance, to heat homes, in this case, where we take one wind turbine's worth of power in proportional terms, and we feed it to a heat pump, we can get 70 gigawatts from 67 gigawatts of electricity. We can get 70 gigawatts of heat in people's homes. And in fact, even that, 67 gigawatts of installed capacity. Yeah, when we talk about gigawatt hours, it's actually a lot better than that. We get 26 gigawatts worth of electricity out of 67 gigawatts worth of wind turbine installed capacity, and we end up with 70 gigawatts worth of heat in the home. So the efficiency here is actually higher than 100% because heat pumps do that. They use work in the form of electricity to pump heat from cold places to warm places. But if we go the hydrogen route, now we're talking about 6 wind turbines worth of equivalent energy going through this bunch of losses in order to produce 70 gigawatts of heat in the home. So it's just not sensible. It's not affordable. And you can understand why it's being pushed despite that. And that's because if you sell gas door to door in a piping system and that's your business, you're going to be talking about hydrogen until you're dead, because the alternative is to admit that you're going out of business post decarbonization. As far as blending is concerned, the problem is that once you hit 20%, your next step is 100%, not 30 and then 40. End use devices would all need to change for pure hydrogen. Compressors would need to be replaced. Green hydrogen probably won't be cheap enough. I would say it almost certainly won't be cheap enough. And blue hydrogen's carbon capture is so partial that the decarbonization potential is really quite poor. So justifying the use of hydrogen for low temperature heating is basically impossible. There's no use case. And in fact, there's 55 independent studies that agree with me on that topic to date, and more still coming. Where does hydrogen fit? Well, this is Michael Liebreich's hydrogen ladder. And it's a nice meme that gives you an idea. The top rung uses are uses where there really aren't any alternatives. And the bottom rung uses are really dumb uses like cars and 2- and 3-wheelers and metro trains and buses and the like. And in the middle, you have uses that we might reach for if we're desperate, or maybe they're not very important uses, or the alternatives that are proposed like electric or biomass are not very appealing, and we choose hydrogen despite it being more expensive and more troublesome in other respects. So the notion that hydrogen is just a one-for-one replacement for fossil fuels is just not accurate, and most of the use cases don't make sense for it. This is the Hydrogen Science Coalition's basic statement of its principles, and they're really to understand, and I'll just run through them quickly. First of all, you look at it from a dispassionate scientific perspective, only green hydrogen that's made by the use of new, proximate, and temporally matched renewable electricity is clean enough in order to actually qualify as decarbonizing hydrogen. Can't waste electrification opportunities in order to make hydrogen. The highest priority use for any new green electricity that we make is to get rid of dirty electricity on the grid. Don't think of hydrogen as an export commodity. So the notion of these export products in Eastern Canada that are going to turn wind energy into hydrogen and then hydrogen into ammonia for export, those are largely economic fantasy. Decarbonize the dirty hydrogen first. Really, we need to focus on the no regret uses, which are replacing black hydrogen with green. And let's just get this idea of blending hydrogen into the fossil gas network out of our heads, because it's not a real decarbonization strategy, but a predatory delay strategy. Where does it fit? It fits green hydrogen to replace black hydrogen, as a chemical feedstock for making ammonia, for desulfurization, as a reducing agent to make iron out of iron ore, to improve biofuels yields. Maybe if we're rich and desperate to make some e-fuels like methanol, maybe some niche uses in hydrogen for heating, but it's really as simple as my little meme here. Hydrogen as a fuel, forget it. Green hydrogen to replace hydrogen, black hydrogen, that's the way to think of it. Briefly, some other dumb stuff that won't work. Direct air capture definitely fits. Direct air capture isn't just a cute but hapless energy destroyer that's decades before its time. It's actually a predatory delay strategy by the fossil fuel industry and a fossil fuel meme. And if you don't believe me, believe Vicky Holub, who's the CEO of Oxy Petroleum, because she said as much. They bought a company called Carbon Engineering in BC that's doing direct air capture. They're one of the major proponents. And she says here that this gives our industry a license to continue to operate for the 60, 70, or 80 years that I think it's going to be very much needed. That's what it's about. Direct air capture is dumb. We shouldn't be spending a cent of money on it. And I can explain that to you in excruciating detail as a chemical engineer if you wish. So what are the real strategies for decarbonization in my last few minutes here? First of all, let's get rid of this primary energy fallacy notion. What you'll see from the likes of Václav Smil is that we use an enormous amount of energy in the form of fossils. We have to replace that, every joule that we get by burning natural gas or coal or petroleum, we have to replace with a joule of electricity, and hence it's impossible. And the reality of the situation is that it's still very difficult, but it's about a third as difficult as Václav Smil says, because this great big gray box here, that's all the rejected energy, all of the wasted heat energy that's being used in the process of transforming chemical energy, which is basically a proxy for heat, into mechanical energy or electricity, which is a proxy for work. In a decarbonized future, we don't have to replace the light gray box. We only have to replace the dark gray box. It's still a tremendous challenge, but it's way more possible than replacing the whole shebang. So we have to get rid of the primary energy fallacy to be able to begin. The second thing we have to do is we have to put a price on carbon. It must be durable. It must be increasing. It must be hard to defraud. And it must be international with tariffs to back it up, because some people won't do it. If you think that decarbonization can happen without a carbon price, I'm sorry, you're not thinking about the problem properly. You're just wrong, okay? And if that sounds harsh, I meant it to, because you can't solve an economic problem with technology unless you solve the underlying broken economics that treat the atmosphere as a free public sewer. Next, we have to electrify everything or nearly everything. Not all at once, not instantly, but as much as we can, as fast as we can. And that's in practical terms. It's going to take a long time. It's going to cost trillions of dollars, but we have to do it because we have no choice. We must build excess renewable energy generation and not sweat over the excess. We must build wider grids so that we can share energy from places that have it to places that don't, which may shift from time to time, like time of day or whether the wind is blowing in this area versus that area. We have to build storage, but not as much storage as some people think. Certainly not the month of grid storage that this guy, Simon Michaud, argues in his argument about the whole thing and why the transition's impossible. We don't need to build anything close to a month's grid storage. That's just insane. We need to keep fossils or stored biofuels for emergencies. We definitely need to store fuel in the chemical form for emergencies. Hydrogen is a possible alternative there, but there are better ones. We need to match supply to demand better by using smart demand management. The example I give is that right now, when I push the start button on my electric dryer, it turns on. In the future, when I press the start button on my electric dryer, it's going to say, I'm going to turn on at 11:01 p.m. when electricity is cheap, unless you push the button again because you need your clothes dry right now. It's literally that simple, like charging electric cars at night. Like I've charged my electric car at night for the past more than a decade. Yes, we will, in fact, make materials and chemicals from petroleum. We'll just do it without the burning. And I've got a nice article on that. If you think that that's impossible, we've been told that's impossible. Whoever told you that didn't know what they were talking about. It's absolutely possible. No new inventions are required. Number 10, we won't run out of materials or mine ourselves into a mortar economy. The people that are making those arguments are making them from the point of view of moral hazard often. Or sometimes just because they're making bad assumptions, like Michaud, who assumes that we need a month's worth of battery storage plus electric vehicles, which honestly, it's totally unjustified. Don't sweat industrial heating. This is something I work on fairly often in my consulting practice. This is a histogram of United States industrial heat use versus temperature in 2014. And you can see that of the, whatever that is, 11,000 quads, or sorry, trillion BTU of heat energy that they use, almost 8,000 or so is used below temperatures of 200 degrees C, where heat pumping works. So honestly, the hard part is only this part, and it's not that hard. Most of the time, people are stuck with the burner box on their heads, and that's the real problem with heating. And number 42, stop smoking the hopium. Okay, no false hope and putting things off, waiting for fusion or waiting for some other thing. But there's no need to panic either. Don't panic. And with that, I will leave you with one admonition before we go on to questions. I have, in the interest of time, had to make a lot of statements of opinion as if they were fact. Okay. Now, my opinions are justified, I think, by really good writings, which you can find at spitfireresearch.com. You can also find on my LinkedIn profile, where I've gone through in detail and explained why I think the things that I do. And I also have conversations with very well-informed people there who act as my peer review. They catch arithmetic mistakes that I make. They correct misperceptions that I have. I don't claim to know everything, but I do claim to care a great deal more about getting issues right than I do about being right personally. So please don't accept what I've said as fact just because I might be convincing. Please go and review those resources and come to understand how I've come to the conclusions that I've come to. And then if you agree with me, agree with me. And with that, I'll leave the floor open to questions. And I think I'm just about right on time. And Raymond, would you like me to turn my share screen off, or?
Yeah, if you could please, and I'll just go over the questions. So, first of all, thank you very much, Paul. That was excellent. It's material that I've been familiar with for a while, but it's nice to have a real expert explain all these things. As the host, I get to ask the first question, but we'll put Richard on deck. He's got the first question after that. But my question is, we need to electrify or decarbonize everything to have any hope of mitigating climate change. What's your sense of our progress on developing the technologies that do that, and do we have enough materials to make that happen?
Sure, that's a really big question. I won't spend the whole next 45 minutes answering it, which I easily could. But my evaluation has been that there's an awful lot of what I would call nirvana fallacy argument going on in the world right now. So there are a lot of people that would really like things to not change. They're trying to find a way to either delay it, put it off, or make it seem that it's so hard that we shouldn't even start. And often issues like materials come up, and those issues they're factual, like there are real issues there, but they've taken the kernel of a real issue, a real but small issue, and they've turned it into popcorn with hyperbole. And as a consequence, they've made mountains out of molehills. And from my perspective, looking at the transition, I don't see a single material related problem with the transition from fossil fuels as our primary energy source to renewable electricity as our energy source. The real problem that I see isn't a lack of technology. It's not that we need new inventions. The problem is that we haven't solved the underlying economic problem, which is we keep using the atmosphere as if it were a free or very cheap public sewer. And we expect decarbonization to happen just because people want to be better, want to behave better. And that will not happen. People won't do that. So they have to have an economic reason to do it. And if we don't provide it, decarbonization won't happen. I can say that I've been aware of these issues since I graduated from university, which was, a long time ago. And I've been very disappointed with our progress in some respects and very heartened by our progress in others. I mean, the fact that solar has gotten so cheap, wind has gotten so cheap, batteries have been astounding in their development, and they haven't finished getting better. I'm very hopeful, but I'm not an optimist. So, and with that, I think I could, like I said, I could go on, but I won't because I want to answer more questions.
Oh, well, thanks very much for that answer. So we'll put Zach on deck, but Richard's got the first question. Richard?
Okay, thank you. I just have a quick question. I have read about hydrogen coming in the form of a powder, which is supposedly safer for transport. I'm not sure how efficient it is or anything. I wonder if you might speak to that.
Sure. Well, I've got a long article. Unfortunately, it's too long. I should really chop it up into about 6 or 7 little ones, but it's called The Myth of Hydrogen for Export. And it looks at every single one of those options. Okay. So it looks at making liquid hydrogen and transporting it. It looks at making ammonia and using that as a hydrogen transport method. It looks at methanol. It looks at these things that they call liquid organic hydrogen carriers, which are molecules that you hydrogenate at one end and then you dehydrogenate at the other. And it looks at these metal hydride powders that you were talking about. And the problem with all of them, it's the same. You end up wasting a whole bunch more energy in order to try to make hydrogen more effective, meaning easier to ship and transport. And that extra energy loss is expensive, but so is the equipment at both ends, to make the powder and then to make hydrogen out of it and then to make the powder back into the metal hydride again. And unfortunately, the energy efficiency chains are just so disastrously bad in ways that innovation isn't going to fix. I just don't hold out hope for any of them.
So just to clarify, so the bottom line here is your thinking is currently is that hydrogen is not a solution in any way.
Hydrogen is a decarbonization problem that we need to solve. And we can solve that problem by making green hydrogen in places like Western Australia, Chile, Western Africa, some parts of North Africa, et cetera, in order to make things like ammonia and methanol and decarbonized direct reduced iron from iron ore and other things like that. So the problem of hydrogen as a greenhouse gas emission problem, it's solvable, but using hydrogen as a way to replace fossil fuels, that's just not on. It's not a solution to anything except for one thing. It's a really good solution if you're in the fossil fuel industry and you want to delay real decarbonization by holding out false hope that there's a replacement for the stuff that you sell.
Yeah, well, that's worth that. Okay, thank you.
So, Rob, if you could be on deck. So, John Legg, your question. Oh, sorry, it's Zach. Sorry, and John on deck.
Well, let me applaud you for saying what you said about direct air capture. I agree entirely. But you haven't mentioned the thoughts of using nuclear energy as a way of producing green hydrogen, as opposed to altogether renewables.
Sure.
Just a comment on that.
I'll give you my brief 30 cents on nuclear. Nuclear can be made adequately safe, and it's very low GHG emission power. It's available when we need it. Unfortunately, it's expensive. It's not load flexible. It takes a long time to build. it's expensive even when it's done at very large scale, and it's way, way too expensive to feed to electrolyzers to make hydrogen from if you're going to waste the hydrogen as a fuel. So I don't hold out any hope for people making nuclear more affordable by sending excess electricity from nuclear into electrolyzers to make a kind of a secondary product. And I see no future for people making economical hydrogen by use of nuclear power.
Okay, so next question is John Legg, and Rob will be after that. John, if you could unmute.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. I can't get my face on the screen, but I think everyone's going to be just as well off without that. So my my question is, sorry about that. Start my video. Okay. All right. There we go. There we are. Oh, I'll take off my dark glasses now. After speaking for about 45 minutes, you seem to be saying what Richard just said a little while ago, that hydrogen just does not work for all uses you have mentioned. So the real question seems to be, and I'm going out slightly on a branch here, why has hydrogen survived until now, if it has indeed survived, with a more or less passable reputation?
Sure. I can answer that one pretty succinctly. It's a simple-minded solution, like answer to the wrong question. So if you ask the question, how we can't burn fossils anymore, what else can we burn? The answer's got to be hydrogen or something made from hydrogen, like ammonia. But if you ask the question that you should be asking, which is, we can't burn fossils anymore, how do we get the energy services that we need in the decarbonized future without generating greenhouse gas emissions? The answer to that question is almost never hydrogen. Hydrogen is possible as a solution, but it's not economic, and there are better ones. And so why is it popular? It's popular because A, it's simple-minded. And the other problem is that it's being pushed by people that will be out of business unless they've got a gas to sell door to door in their pipes. People that want to replicate the fossil fueled paradigm so they can stay in business by selling something else, because they don't want to sell electricity, because they're not in the electricity business. They're in the chemicals or the gas selling business. So there's an awful lot of that too. And then of course the third one is that there are people that are making renewable electricity that are desperately upset with us for good reasons, because we're not building grids fast enough in order to distribute their product to market. And so they're going, oh man, how do I get power to people that need it? I can't move it as electricity. Is there something else I can make out of it to make a buck? And so they think, oh, okay, how about hydrogen? And that's great. That would be great if they were making hydrogen to make ammonia so we could use it as fertilizer, and hence we could stop making that hydrogen from natural gas. The problem is there's no money in that. So they're going in the direction that subsidy pushes them, which is to waste hydrogen as a fuel. And that's just dumb. Like, it doesn't make sense. It's not affordable and it's not effective. So it's, to my mind, that's really what's going on. And so there are earnest but foolhardy people. There's the fossil fuel industry and its useful idiots. And, there are people that, are like a dog with a bone, and they think hydrogen's the solution. They just will not change their minds. And I've met all of them. And by the way, I was a huge proponent of hydrogen. I have patents in the area, like I said, but rationally looking at it, dispassionately, and seeing the alternatives of electrification come along, it's no longer, to my mind, a viable solution. And yet it's still being pushed. So yeah, anyway, that's the deal.
And of course, I can't help adding the Von, was there a Von in front of Hindenburg? Anyway, it's the big dirigible that went up in a big explosion. So much for transportation.
Yeah,
anyway.
well, the Hindenburg, the Hindenburg is kind of interesting because what you'll hear from people is, well, that wasn't a hydrogen fire. That was the nitrocellulose dope on the fabric that caught fire, and that was the source of the problem. And the answer is no, it was actually a hydrogen fire that was made colorful by the nitrocellulose dope on the outside of the dirigible that was burning. But whatever. The point being, hydrogen's, I think, as somebody that's contended with the problems of working with hydrogen for 30 years, we know how to use hydrogen safely in industry, and the safety issues don't really trouble me all that much. When you start talking about ammonia, oh, don't get me started. Like, people thinking of using ammonia as a fuel, they're just like crazy. And somebody should smack them upside the head before they kill people. But hydrogen, we can manage the hydrogen safety issues.
Yeah, so ammonia, it's about the toxicity of ammonia, right?
Yeah, ammonia is not just toxic. It's not just toxic to aquatic organisms at 1 ppm. It's also extremely corrosive. So you can't just put a respirator on and escape, because it'll corrode your tissues, the tissues of your body, anywhere where there's moisture. Ammonia is insidiously dangerous as a toxic chemical, and the thought of using it as a fuel on board ships is positively insane. Like people will die needlessly as a result of that decision. I can't say it any more clearly. And this is based, I've worked with chemicals that make ammonia look like mother's milk, okay? And ammonia as a fuel in an open system type application is terrifying to me, because I know it will kill people.
Thank you for your answer and your fantastic presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Rob will be next, and then it'll be Dave Doherty after that. So Rob?
Thank you, Paul. This has been a really cool presentation. I initially thought, as I think a lot of people did, that hydrogen would be a good way forward, and just going through the basic thermodynamics of it has been really, really enlightening. To make a comment about the fossil fuel industry pushing it, Danielle Smith has actually said that she drives a hydrogen car. So that right there, that's should make us worry a little.
She drives a hydrogen car that Toyota basically donates to people.
Oh, is that what it is?
Well, yeah, well, they subsidize something like 3/4 of the cost of their hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, and they basically still can't get rid of them.
Oh,
So,
wow.
Michael Liebreich has a really lovely slide that I wish I'd put in my presentation, which is a graph on the same scale of electric vehicle sales versus hydrogen vehicle sales, year by year.
Yeah.
And the hydrogen vehicle sales, they're less than a pixel wide, so they're invisible.
Wow. So my question initially, was why I thought hydrogen was bad is it's such a small molecule. What if it leaks from pipes, because it could easily leak? And I believe that it's a pretty potent greenhouse gas.
It is, yeah.
So
Both of those things, are true. Both of those things are true, and they would be worrisome if we were to foolishly roll out hydrogen as a natural gas replacement. Leakage would be a big problem, less of a problem for safety and more of a problem for because it's a greenhouse gas.
Yeah.
It's interesting. It's not a greenhouse gas itself. What happens with hydrogen is it goes into the upper atmosphere and it messes with the processes that destroy other greenhouse gases like methane. And as a consequence, it makes the methane last longer. So it's not a greenhouse gas, but it acts like one. And it's quite a potent one. And it leaks very readily. That's mitigated by having a high diffusivity and other things. But the other thing that it does is it has a tendency to embrittle the materials that we normally use to carry natural gas, and that leads to risks of pipes rupturing.
How does it embrittle it?
It reacts with oxides at the surface. It dissociates into hydrogen atoms, which then make their way between the grains of the metal. And if there are voids or imperfections inside the metal, they recombine to form hydrogen, and they form pockets of hydrogen, and those become crack initiation sites. Cool. And they cause the crack to grow because the mechanisms by which the crack might heal in the metal are prevented by the presence of the hydrogen. The hydrogen acts kind of like a wedge to keep the grains from healing. And I mean, this is a very well-known issue. And if you want to read more about it, I have an article that's called Hydrogen to Replace Natural Gas by the Numbers. And it goes into all of the detail of all of this stuff. And yeah, the natural gas industry is telling you, yeah, don't worry about it. It's all fine. It's no problem. Just give us billions of dollars and we can move hydrogen, no problem. You know, because their alternative is to go to business. So.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll have Dave Doherty and then Steve Curtis will be next after that.
Thank you very much. Very interesting, Paul. I was really intrigued by one comment that you made, and I would like to ask this question. Why do you think we should not panic? The lady I call Greta the Great thinks it is time to panic. I posit she feels that if we don't panic, we'll continue on our current path, which is clearly headed for disaster at +7 degrees C or more in the very foreseeable future. So why should we not panic?
Why should we not panic? Well, the reason we shouldn't panic is that when we panic, we don't think clearly and we don't take appropriate actions. So it's reasonable. It's reasonable to be fearful. Okay, fear is a reasonable response to danger, and AGW is dangerous. It really is a danger, and it's a danger that we're causing to ourselves. But we need to be clear-headed, which means that we can't be panicking. We can't be running around like chickens with our heads cut off. We have to think carefully and make appropriate choices. And the other thing that we can't do is we can't latch on to false hope, right? We can't smoke the hopium pipe and pick the false solutions, and hydrogen's one of them, right? So if we panic, the natural gas industry will be standing there handing us hydrogen, and we'll be going, well, shit, we have to do something, right? So that's why
I agree with certain aspects of what you said, but I would argue that where you started with you won't have clear thinking is in fact exactly where we are.
Mm-hmm.
We are not panicking, but we are not thinking clearly.
I will 100% agree with you, Dave, on that point. That we are not thinking about this clearly. If we were thinking about it clearly, 30 years ago, we would have been taking actions to mitigate this, including starting with a carbon tax, and we didn't do that. And so now we're 30 years behind. And honestly, the thing that I'm a little bit concerned about, you know, getting on in years and having kids, is that future generations are going to look at my generation and they'll say, well, the generations before his generation, they kind of didn't know about it. So we can't really blame them too much. But his generation knew about it and didn't do anything about it anyway. And, you know, we will be very blameworthy under those circumstances. So I really hope that we do turn around. And I don't think that there's any technological reason that we can't turn around and make the changes that are required. But my concern is that we seem to think it's going to happen by magic with no economic driver behind it. And I know that that's not going to happen. You know, people that are thinking that ESG type movements among businesses are going to fix it, or voluntary actions of individuals are going to fix it, or whatever, you know, I'm sorry, that's just wrong. We need carbon taxes and emission bans. And if we don't have them, we won't transition except where transitioning is cheaper, right? Where greenhouse gas emissions cost nothing, and yet the thing that eliminates the greenhouse gas emissions is cheaper than making them, you know, like LED lighting or electric cars. Those are great things, but that's not enough. Like, we're going to have to do some hard stuff like transitioning, you know, heating in homes. It's going to cost a lot more money. And we're going to have to do that despite the fact that it costs more. And unfortunately, we seem to think that it's going to happen by magic. We're smoking the hopium pipe, hoping the whole thing will go away. Or the big vacuum cleaners will come along and suck the CO2 back out of the atmosphere after the fact, right? That's all hopium smoking. Mm-hmm. We have to be more mature and adult about it and get on with it. And you know, we shouldn't panic. We should just get on with it.
Well, I don't think anybody's going to get on with it. I think what we do need is grim determination, not hope. So thank you. Over to the follow.
Okay, so Steve Kurtz is next, and after that it'll be Art Hunter.
Hey, thanks, Paul. It was a wonderful talk. My question it has to do with what you were saying about Simon Michaud's analyses. I'll read it. Alt electricity infrastructure has on average a 2-decade lifespan. Michaud has researched the mining, refining, fabrication of parts, transport at each step, assembly, maintenance, disassembly, some recycling, which takes energy, massive grid expansion, etc. So why do you think electrification can replace fossil fuels, or perhaps you don't? Now, just one aside is that I've been for every effort to reverse population growth for the last 3+ decades as being the only way we're going to reduce throughput, because humans are just gluttons to consume like all life. But I'll let you answer on the electrification issue.
Well, I'll answer on the first one, on the last one first, and that is that the good news is that human population is likely to reach a peak in the foreseeable future, which in the 1970s seemed absolutely impossible. So that's good, and I agree that that's necessary and desirable. If there are fewer of us, there's less fighting over the resources that we do have, and that can lead nowhere but good. On the other side, though, when you look at Michaud's analysis, Michaud, yeah, he says, well, hey, grids take a lot of materials and energy to produce, and he's right. But what he does is he makes a straw man out of the transition by making a really, really dumb assumption. And that dumb assumption is that we need to store a month's worth of grid power in batteries. That assumption is totally unjustified, and it leads entirely to his conclusion. And his conclusion is wrong because his assumptions are wrong. Okay, so
well, I don't believe his whole
I
argument is based on that.
I don't agree with you because I've actually looked at the analysis, and that's where the majority of the problems come from. They come from that fundamental assumption. And by the way, I'm not the only person who thinks that. A large number of people have looked at Michaud's work and drawn the same conclusions, including a guy named Åke Hoekstra in the Netherlands, who, if you haven't heard about him, you really should look at his work. So I do not agree with Michaud. Michaud is a doomer, and he's trying to make a point that the transition is impossible because of materials. And in order to make that point, he has to exaggerate the problem. And he's wrong. He's just wrong. So,
well, perhaps I should rephrase my question then, or the parts that you've avoided, which is that the finite lifespan of all of the infrastructure for solar and wind, for example, and geothermal and tidal, if they ever get developed. Deep geothermal is another one, but they have finite lifespans, and mining is fossil fuel.
So does all equipment.
Right,
okay?
And mining has a fossil fuel dependency now. You can't do this stuff without it.
And when you look at the studies, which I have done, you will find that the energy returned per unit energy invested, much less the much more important exergy returned per unit exergy invested of wind and solar is already better than that of the next barrel of oil that we have to find, refine, and burn. So that argument was definitely true in the 1980s, the one that you just made. It is not true anymore and hasn't been true for well over a decade. So the argument that, well, stuff doesn't last forever and we have to replace it. Well, guess what? Guess what we don't have to do in a decarbonized future? We don't have to mine fossils because we're continually burning them and dumping them into the atmosphere, where recycling is totally impossible. And the other side of it that we have is that we have the whole middle of the periodic table for substitutions, which we did not have with respect to fossil fuels. So from my perspective, most of the materials-related arguments that I've seen made have been made on the basis of something like a confusion between resources and reserves, or ignoring the possibility of substitution, or ignoring the opportunities for technological change in order to switch our dependencies from one thing to another. And the perfect example is lithium. Lithium was a total panic for all kinds of people. I never panicked over lithium. I gave good reasons for why I wasn't panicking over lithium. And in the meantime, sodium ion has come along, and there's not a single thing in a sodium ion battery that isn't in the top 10 list of abundance on the Earth. So again,
Well, I hope you're right.
I've looked at it fairly carefully. It is not my primary area of interest, but I have looked at it fairly carefully, and I'm not panicking. And I suggest that you shouldn't either.
Well, it's just a matter of multiple generations of this material has to be continually produced.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
you seem to
does,
think you
it
can.
does,
Yeah.
and it's not an issue. And with that,
Okay.
I think we should move on to the next question. Not because I
Okay.
want to cut you off, but just because there are more questions. So
Actually, we could
Okay.
talk about it later if you wish, once we're done with the formal part. So Rob is on deck, and then Art, you have a question about geothermal.
Yeah, I think, Paul, you should know that I started to electrify everything 7 years ago, and I converted my house into a microgrid where I have geothermal. I have 3 Tesla Powerwall batteries. I drive 2 EVs in this household, and of course, lots of solar on the roof. My question is with regards to this electrify everything. I have done so, and I've electrified everything for transportation and in the house, and that accounts for 18% of the energy which is consumed in this household. The rest is heat. And so when one takes a look at energy and what one should focus on, I have focused 82 of my financing and attention on geothermal heating. And right now I have a ground source heat pump where I have the heat exchanger that's buried, 2 meters in the ground, and where the temperature is essentially isothermal at about 12 degrees C year round. And so that's just perfect for energy extraction, as well as a place to dump excess heat from the summer. Interestingly enough, I also heat hot water geothermally, which in this time of year when it's really hot, the air conditioning is running, and I'm off and heating up the ground, and then I go off and go to heat hot water, and I'm withdrawing that same heat that I just dumped in the ground to heat hot water. So in essence, my air conditioning is heating my hot water, just passing through the ground temporarily. And but I'm a big geothermal fan, and because in my mind it has so many merits, and most of the time it is ignored. And I just be interested in your comments on geothermal.
Two kinds of geothermal. Okay, there's ground source heat pumping, which you're talking about. Ground source heat pumping. Ground source heat pumping is a way to use dramatically less electricity to do the same job that you can do with air source heat pumping. And ultimately, it is a trade-off of saving electricity by spending more capital, drilling wells and installing the ground source heat exchange. As electricity gets cheaper, that optimization will shift in the direction of wasting more electricity and building less geothermal. And that's kind of unfortunate, because all electricity use has negative implications associated with it, environmental impacts and so on. So it would be great if we could encourage, by means of policy, more use of ground source heat pumping, and to do it more centrally rather than having individual homeowners try to do it on their own homes. We could combine ground source heat pumping, source wells, and also semi-annual heat storage of a centralized nature, and then do heat networks as part of new developments. And by the way, that this is already happening in Toronto, in downtown Toronto. In the large buildings, there's a company called Enwave, which is doing not just cooling using some of the, by warming up drinking water a little bit before it goes into the drinking water system, but is also doing some of these heat networks in the large developments downtown, including a very large heat storage system. So the other side of geothermal is when people think of geothermal, they're often thinking about geothermal heating of water to make steam, to make electricity. And that technology, it's been around for a long time, and some people in the fossil fuel industry are trying to redirect their skills at drilling holes in the ground into doing a better job of making geothermal electricity. And I encourage that. That sounds great to me. But my evaluation of geothermal is that unfortunately it's just too risky. There are too many, unless you have a resource and you know where it is, trying to find one is challenging, and they're not present everywhere on the earth within a distance that's easy enough to drill to. So I like your solution a lot better than I like geothermal electricity.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that we have an existing geothermal system in every city in the world. Only we call it wastewater.
Mm-hmm.
It's our storm sewage system as well as our blackwater system.
Yeah.
And there's
and in Europe there are very large heat pumps recovering that heat.
And hey, it's right next to every building.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't have to go far for it, and it's
definitely
a big
it's definitely an untapped source of heat, and one we should put more effort into. I'm a big fan of heat pumping. I think industrial heating and coupling heat uses to current heat rejection uses can be extremely important in industry, but it can also be extremely important for residences, and if it's done smartly. So yeah, I see that as a big potential future opportunity.
Okay,
I
good.
guess
Thank
we
you
should
very
probably
much.
get another couple questions in here, because I do have to leave hard on
Yep.
3:00. So
Okay, so we'll try to take two more very quick questions. So I fear this one might not be quick, but Rob has got a question on carbon tax.
So I made a comment on the carbon tax. The Axe the Tax crowd just won the riding in Toronto. That was a long-time Liberal riding.
yeah, that has more to do with Trudeau's unpopularity than with the carbon tax's
So
unpopularity in Ontario.
totally.
I live in Ontario, so
No, but more from that though. So where I'm going to go with that question though is more specifically, how do we implement policy that can be sustainable despite governments that may be adverse to acting on it?
100% excellent, top-notch question. The answer is I have no frigging idea. It's a huge problem, but it's a problem that we need to solve if we're going to address climate change. Because I'll tell you, I'm dealing with investors as an example as part of my business. So I'll have people come in and they'll say, hey, we've got this innovator who's come up with this neat new way to decarbonize X, whatever X is. And
Yep.
they think that they can break even at $50 a ton carbon tax. Right. And then we'll build them a pilot plant and they'll find out, well, no, actually, they were optimistic. They need $100 a ton carbon tax. Well, can the investors in their right mind make an investment in something that needs $100 a ton carbon tax to break even if the election of a different government totally eliminates their value proposition? Of course not.
No.
So trillions of dollars of smart money is sitting on the sidelines, not investing in any of this because they think that it's horseshit. Okay? Because they look at it and they say, look, you guys say that you're all about decarbonization, but you're not willing to put your money where your mouth is. You're not serious. Wake us up when you get serious. And the trouble is, how do you get that to happen on a public policy level? It's very, very difficult. But I will give you one note of hope. And that is, we were told that we would never have a carbon tax in Canada. We were told that we'd have these gilets jaunes protesting in the streets, that there'd be like riots and stuff going on. We had 2 elections where the carbon tax figured prominently. They were both successful. There was a Supreme Court challenge by 4 climate change denialist premiers. That Supreme Court challenge was unsuccessful. The carbon tax remains the law of the land. And honestly, if Poilievre gets elected, it'll be because people who believe in the carbon tax think that Trudeau needs to go.
Yep.
And that would be a terrible shame. But the answer to your question is, man, I have no idea. If I knew that, I would tell everybody that would listen.
And then finally, could we repurpose LNG pipe infrastructure into some sort of ground source heat pump infrastructure at some point in the future?
Probably not. And what we definitely can't do is repurpose LNG infrastructure for liquid hydrogen. That was mentioned at the G7 by Trudeau.
Yeah.
So somebody at the PMO had that, some bright spark at the PMO had that idea. And when I heard it, I was drinking coffee and I spewed coffee all over my screen, laughing so hard because it was such a stupid statement to make. I've got an article on that topic if you want to find out just how dumb it is. But yeah, we're not repurposing any fossil fuel infrastructure for use with hydrogen in the future, including LNG. And no, we won't be using it for heat pumping because it's the wrong equipment.
So what are we going to
Not
do with that
sized
infrastructure that exists?
It'll be garbage. It'll be scrapped.
Yeah, sunk costs and
It'll be scrapped.
yeah,
And
yeah.
and by the way, you think that's something? Think about the distribution infrastructure for natural gas.
Yeah.
100% of that infrastructure is scrapped too.
Well, same week they bought the same week the carbon tax came into effect, didn't they buy a pipeline?
Yeah. So Rob, we're gonna have to wrap
Yeah.
it up.
Thank you.
Paul,
Yeah,
and
I
sorry
do
about
have
that. Yeah, and actually, I'll let Jean give the official thanks. But for my part, I'd like to really thank you, and I'll get Jean to the more formal part.
Thank you, Raymond. And I am the past president of CACOR, and it is my pleasure to thank you on behalf of CACOR for this absolutely fascinating presentation. You gave a lot of information that I'd never heard before, and it was really, really interesting to think through some of the economic things that you were discussing as well. This was a really fascinating presentation, so thank you very much for this. I would also like to say for everybody who is still with us or comes to look at this video presentation later, you can see this presentation if you subscribe to our YouTube channel. Go to canadiancore.com and do the subscribe button, and here you will get the information on how to look at this particular video when it becomes available, and also be able to look at all the other videos that we have had for our presentations that have been put up on the YouTube channel. It's a fascinating amount of a fabulous amount of information, and over 200 presentations that are up there now. So you are more than welcome to look at that. If you're interested in getting more information about CACOR, please go to our website, canadiancore.com, and look for information about membership. And also, if you wish to donate to us, just straight donation rather than joining the membership, you're more than welcome to do so. You can do that by hitting the donate button on the website. With that, I'd like to say thank you to everyone who's come today, and thank you, Paul, for an absolutely wonderful presentation today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.